Today we will be looking at the Scramble for Africa, which is the first unit in Term 3's work. We will be looking at what Africa looked like before colonization, why colonization happened, and what Africa looked like after the colonization process had finished. We are on page 116 in our textbooks. You can follow along there, or you can watch the slides and take notes as we go. I hope the cartoon on the right looks familiar because we analysed it together 2 weeks ago, and hopefully you'll remember what we spoke about because that will shed some light on what we will be speaking about today. Looking at Africa before colonization, Africa had a very long pre-colonial history going back thousands of years before colonization. For example, archaeological evidence shows that the Nok culture thrived in what is now Nigeria from around 1000 BC to 500 AD. There were also many powerful kingdoms spread across Africa before colonization, including the kingdoms of Mali, Songhai and Ghana, Great Zimbabwe, and Mapungubwe. These kingdoms were well organized, enjoyed political autonomy, had complex trading systems, were technologically advanced, had their own education systems, practiced agriculture, and had rich cultural and religious beliefs and practices. Socially and political, pre-colonial societies were either stateless, state-run, or kingdoms. Members in all societies took part in the daily running of the tribe. Land was held commonly and could not be bought or sold, but other things such as cattle were individually owned. In terms of education, pre-colonial societies were educationally advanced, and a strong emphasis was placed on traditional forms of education, and included transmitting cultural values and skills. Pre-colonial African societies displayed evidence of having mining technology, as well as architectural and building skills. Many pre-colonial African societies depended on agriculture. There is also evidence that they kept cattle, sheep, goats, and dogs. They farmed millet, sorghum, and cotton. Pre-colonial African societies had rich and varied cultural and religious practices that were based on ancestor worship and linked to beliefs about their origins, the stories of their journeys, and the cycles and events in their lives. Some of these rituals involved sacrifices. Many religious practices focused on specifically chosen people, such as healers or diviners, who could communicate with their ancestors, heal people, and predict the future. In terms of trade, pre-colonial Africa had well-developed trading systems. In the north, trade was carried out across the Sahara Desert to Europe and eastwards towards Arabia, India, and China. In southern Africa, the Mapungubwe region was the center of trade, trading with East Africa and Egypt, and places as far away as Persia, India, and China. Archaeological evidence shows that trade in pre-colonial Africa included gold, iron, copper, pottery, wood, and ivory. Africa's first main contact with Europeans was through the Atlantic slave trade, and by 1800 trade with Europe had grown and some European countries had set up trading settlements on the coast or along major rivers in Africa. By the time of the Berlin Conference in 1884, there was growing trade between Europe and Africa. There was also competition between Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium to control this trade. In some parts of Africa, European countries were already building railways to link trading posts to inland areas, signing treaties with African chiefs to gain control over trade, sending troops to protect their trading interests, and starting to take over some areas of land. By the time of the Berlin Conference, only some coastal areas of Africa were colonized by the European powers. However, these powers had begun to more aggressively try and gain control over the interior of the continent. And some European leaders began to think that this competition over Africa might lead to war. This was because the Industrial Revolution had created a need for cheap labor, raw materials, and new markets. This push for new territory gave rise to violent conflict amongst European powers. Consequently, in 1884, at the request of Portugal, the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called together the major Western powers of the world to negotiate questions about occupation and to end confusion over the control of Africa. However, no representatives from African countries were invited. The Berlin Conference ended up dividing Africa amongst the Europeans. Countries like Germany, Italy, France, Britain, Portugal and Spain signed an agreement on the division. The leaders who were at the conference decided that certain European countries could control parts of Africa. The Congo was given to Belgium, the Niger River was open to trade for all European countries, and German East Africa became a colony of Germany. At the time of the Berlin Conference, 80% of Africa remained under traditional and local control. But the conference opened the way for other European powers to think that they had the right to expand their interests in Africa. This led to even more competition to take over parts of Africa as colonies and resulted in the Scramble for Africa. During the 3 months of the conference, the colonial powers negotiated new boundaries in the interior of the continent. When they did this, they did not consider the cultural and language boundaries already established by the indigenous African population. By the time the colonization was complete in 1914, the conference participants had fully divided Africa amongst themselves into 50 countries. The result was a confused mixture of geometric boundaries imposed on Africa's people that lacked any logic. These boundaries divided coherent groups of people and merged together very different groups who really did not get along very well. The rights of African people were entirely ignored.